Welcome to Candlelight Mysteries, a place where shadows whisper secrets and every flicker of the flame hides a tale untold. Tonight, beneath the glow of a single candle, we will journey into a story filled with suspense, secrets, and timeless intrigue. Before we begin, I'd love to know a little about you. Where are you listening from, and what drew you to the world of mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's build a circle of mystery lovers together. If you enjoy tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing Candlelight Mysteries family. Here, every flame carries a story, waiting just for you. Now let us step quietly into the darkness and begin. Chapter 1. Black Wax, White Lace. The letter came on a Thursday, the sort of thin-skinned autumn afternoon that made St. Mary Mead smell of damp leaves and boiled quinces. The postmistress, Mrs. Waycross, who possessed the delicate hands of a harpist and the ethics of a magistrate, had recognized the black wax seal with a start, but said nothing, because in the village silence was the most efficient sort of advertisement. She stacked the letter neatly atop the parcels and winked at the clock's pendulum as if to remind it not to gossip. Miss Jane Marple, shawl looped with the tidy defiance of a general's sash, opened her cottage door at precisely 2:15. She accepted the post from young Martin Waycross, who had inherited his mother's fine hands and none of her discretion. "Odd sort of seal, miss," he said, in the way one says this might be nothing. But it's likely something. Odd things are often most sensible." "Martin," Miss Marple said mildly, and closed the door. The seal had been pressed with a ring, oval, perhaps with a flower that might have been a lily or a flame. The wax was the sort of dense black that drank the light rather than caught it. She did not open it at once. Miss Marple knew letters were best understood by their behaviour before they were read. Wait. Smell, the whisper of paper against paper. This one smelled faintly of smoke and something colder, metallic, as if it had been carried in a pocket along with a key. On the mantel, the clock clicked with unembarrassed insistence. Beyond the window, the yew tree's needles seemed like an upright crowd. Miss Marple slid a butter knife beneath the flap and lifted the seal whole, for a habit born of curiosity and long practice. The letter within had been written in a careful hand, the way a stranger might imitate intimacy. "Miss Marple, I arrive before the fête. It is time to settle accounts. You will not see me coming, but you will know me. I am the visitor. I have come to kill you," she breathed out, a small private thing, and held the paper up to the light. It showed a watermark, Ainsworth & Co., a stationery brand sold at the shop in Market Basing. The pen had an old-fashioned nib. The ink had feathered minutely at the upstrokes. There were scratches in the paper near the salutation, as though the writer had hesitated or perhaps pressed too hard. Miss Marple set the letter down atop her lace doily, a domestic coronation, for a threat. She had been threatened before, of course. 60 years of tea and memory taught one that wickedness preferred decent surroundings. Murder, like mildew, thrived best where it oughtn't. What lodged like a burr was not the threat, but the timing. Before the fête, Saturday, 2 days hence. It was a village's entire year wrapped in bunting and raffles. The visitor, then, knew their calendars and their customs. She donned her coat, a respectable navy which confessed to age around the elbows, and stepped into the afternoon. The lane was patterned with leaf shadows. Somewhere, a bicycle bell pinged with self-importance. At the gate of St. Mary's, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Lively, was arranging chrysanthemums with the intensity of a surgeon. "My dear Miss Marple," Mrs. Lively trilled, not looking up. "Have you ever known such a quantity of earwigs? They do adore hiding in the blooms. Earwigs are like certain people." "I only noticed when they spoil the arrangement," Miss Marple said, and then asked, as if in passing, "Will the Blue Boar be quite full for the fête?" "Packed to the rafters. We've a gentleman coming from London, journalistic type, to write us up, And Mr. Allerton's cousin from Bath. Visitors do so boost the raffle, Miss Marple nodded. Visitors were knitting needles through which the village wound itself anew.
And the lilies?
I had thought the church avoided them this time of year. Mrs. Lively frowned delicately. We do. Someone brought a few stems this morning, left at the vestry door with a note for Mr. Lively. Quite a mystery, isn't it?
Oh, and a curious gentleman asked for you at the post this morning.
Tall in a brown coat, rather too thin for the weather.
I told him you live at the end of the gables.
Is that quite right?
I do muddle. Quite right, Miss Marple said, and took her leave before the conversation stitched itself into a cushion of speculation.
Lilies left anonymously.
A gentleman in a thin coat.
A letter with black wax. She made 2 further calls, one at the post office, where Mrs. Waycross denied everything with the theatrical innocence of a guilty cat, and one at the lane where the hedgerows pinched inward and the autumn light went green with secrecy. There a narrow path led to the churchyard. She did not intend the churchyard. It was not in her plans, and Miss Marple prized plans the way other women prized pearls, but plans, like pearls, sometimes broke their strings. It happened quickly, a sort of lurch in the air, as though a swallowed memory had come up wrong. A man, tall and not young, in a brown coat, stumbled from the path and collapsed onto the damp grass. Miss Marple reached him at once. The years had not slowed her capacity for briskness, only honed it. His face was grey, with a tint around the lips that suggested shock. His collar bore a smudge of soil as if he had fallen once already and risen. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist. A pulse, erratic but present. "You are quite safe," she said, because that was the sort of thing one said to people who were not. His eyes opened with difficulty. They were a pale, startled blue that did not seem to know quite where they belonged. He tried to speak, coughed, and brought something out from his pocket with a trembling hand, a folded slip of paper, damp at the edges. He pressed it into her fingers with a desperation that felt intimate. Miss Marple unfolded it, expecting more black wax and melodrama. Instead, it was a scrap from a timetable, market basing to St. Mary Mead. Saturday, Hathras 10, and a name scrawled diagonally across it, Rosamond. The man convulsed with a sudden cough. On his cuff, Miss Marple noticed a dusting of yellow grains clinging stubbornly to the wool. Pollen. She thought of the lilies at the vestry door. She thought, too, of a rhyme from a long time ago, a child's skipping song that ended with a girl who vanished in the rain. The vicar, fetched with swift efficiency by a passing altar boy, arrived with an authority that suggested divinity and first aid could be acquaintance. The man was carried to the parish room where a nurse from the next village could be summoned. Miss Marple answered the vicar's questions with that special brevity which tells the truth while encouraging inattention. She kept the scrap of timetable. She let the pollen remain in the cuff for others to see. People, like earwigs, revealed themselves when left to arrange their own flowers. By evening, the village had its flavour of incident, a man fallen at the churchyard, a mysterious scrap, and Miss Marple seen in the company of the vicar under circumstances no one would call romantic, which made it more appealing to think so. Lamps began to kindle in cottage windows. The lanes grew reflective, like thoughts of which one is not quite proud. It was then, as Miss Marple turned her key in her cottage door, that she felt it, a thin alteration in the air, the way a room keeps the breath of someone who has just left. She closed the door softly behind her. The mantel clock said 6:30. The kettle on the hob kept its counsel. On the mantel itself, just beside the letter with the black seal,
lay an object that had not been there when she left. A lily head detached from its stem.
Its petals bruised at the tips as if from a hurried hand. She did not touch it. She looked instead at the hearthrug, where a fine track of mud marked the pattern between the diamonds, leading from the window to the mantel and back again. A careful intruder, neat-footed, who understood that mud speaks only if one gives it syntax. On the writing desk, a single matchstick had been left, Burnt halfway down, a signal or a mistake, and Miss Marple trusted mistakes less than signals. There was, too, a scent, the faintest trace of a tobacco she had last encountered many years ago in a railway compartment shared with soldiers and evacuees. Not the sweet Cavendish favoured by respectable gents, but a harsher leaf with a foreign edge. Memory brought up a name that had nothing to do with tobacco, Rosamond, and the rhyme followed, unbidden. Rose in the rain, rose in the dark, hush, little rose, don't leave your mark. She set the kettle atop the hob because tea was a habit, and habits are moorings. Then she sat, hands folded, listening to the house think. Outside, a car door closed. Footsteps went away with the reluctance of a child leaving a party. Somewhere a clock struck 7 with an absent-minded air. When she finally allowed herself to rise, she crossed to the door. On the inside of the frame, scratched lightly into the paint where no one would look unless they expected to find it, was a hastily carved symbol, an oval with a flicker inside, the same shape as the ring that had made the wax. She touched it with one fingertip and felt, not fear exactly, but recognition. The kettle began to sing. The room, obliging, filled with a little steam that faded into nothing. Miss Marple poured the tea, and, as the first drop touched porcelain, a shadow moved at the window, tall and thin, pausing only long enough to know he'd been seen. The curtains stirred. Chapter 2. The Fate of Small Sins. By morning, the village had dressed itself in cheerfulness with the same stubbornness it once reserved for blackout curtains. Miss Marple woke to the polite clatter of rain softening into sun, the kind of English compromise that left the hedges shining and the air tender with damp. She pinned her hat with 2 pearl-topped pins, military,
order disguising grandmotherly,
taste, and set out toward the green where the harvest fête was blooming into existence, like a memory one had decided to share. Stalls sprang up along the perimeter, knitted baby bonnets like pastel mushrooms, jars of amber jam, a dartboard whose painted bull had endured more insults than the squire's pride. Children, elaborately scrubbed, wore the fidgety holiness of those about to perform something rehearsed. The church bell tolled 9 with a Sunday voice borrowed for Saturday. A banner declared thanksgiving and fellowship, and only the word, and seemed free of controversy. Mrs. Lively swooped upon Miss Marple with the flutter of a costume drama.
"My dear, how stoic you look. Oh, you mustn't worry about your evening visitor. Mr. Lively says it was doubtless a fox at the window. He's been studying tracks." "Foxes rarely smoke," Miss Marple said.
"But I appreciate his zoological enthusiasm." "Indeed." Mrs. Lively's smile kissed both corners of propriety. "Now, if you could only lend your eyes to the cake table, we've had a small catastrophe." Sabotage is such an ugly word, don't you think? I prefer to say ungenerous conduct. They reached the cake tent, where a battalion of sponges, fruitcakes, and iced marvels stood at attention. Or nearly so. One masterpiece, a 3-tiered plum cake entered by Mrs. Waycross, listened to gravity more than it should, and leaned like a gossip. On its sugared flank, someone had traced, carelessly, and then a little too carefully, an oval with a flicker inside, the same symbol engraved beside Miss Marple's door. Miss Marple examined the mark, the icing crusted under her fingertip with a faint crackle. "A hasty artist," she murmured.
"I wonder did they use a ring?" "Ungenerous conduct," Mrs. Lively repeated, now pale with the pleasing exertion of shock. "And that's not all.
Our raffle book has gone missing. The whole ledger, names, tickets, the very sinew of our modest prosperity."
"I suspect the scouts."
"They do so love mischief. Or someone who doesn't wish one particular name to appear," Miss Marple said. She looked up. The village flowed around them, the Blue Boar's landlord arguing price with Mr. Allerton, a cluster of ladies conferring over jars, the dartboard glowering. Everything appeared benign, which was the chief, trick of harm where it liked to live. Miss Marple, cried a piping voice. It belonged to Kitty Bedford, hair in ribbons and knees an open secret. She blocked Miss Marple's path with the theatre of children who expect plot. We're reciting our rhyme for the display. Do you like it? We did our own words. She sang in a sing-song that had the cruelty of sweetness. Rose in the rain, rose in the dark, hush, little rose.
Don't leave your mark. Stitch up your name, hide all your spark.
When the visitor comes to the green at dusk. Visitor? Miss Marple asked mildly. Kitty wrinkled her nose. Tom said it sounded better than stranger. Teachers like visitor. We found it in the school attic, old songs for wartime plays. Miss Mabbott said it's history. Miss Marple touched the child's arm.
History wears other people's coats, she said, and Kitty ran off.
Possessed by other urgencies. At the Blue Boar's temporary stall, Mr. Pritchard poured ginger beer for the righteous and something browner for the wicked, while his wife, a dove-grey surveillance professional, kept the ledger. Rooms are full, she told Miss Marple without being asked. One gentleman from London, thin coat, thin patience, came late last night and asked first thing for your direction. Journalist, he says.
Name of Hobday.
Wrote it down with a city hand. Thin coats make men dramatic, Miss Marple observed. Do journalists usually visit for raffles?
Not unless the vicar invites them, Mrs. Pritchard sniffed.
But then clergymen do love readers. Miss Marple drifted toward the parish room where the man from the churchyard lay in an improvised infirmary. Nurse fellows, formidable in starched kindness, barred the door and allowed it in the same gesture.
10 minutes only, she decreed.
He was hypothermic, dehydrated and obstinate. Still is. Name as yet unclaimed. The patient, no longer grey but moth-pale, regarded Miss Marple with the caution of someone measuring an exit. You, he said. His voice edged along a rasp.
You kept...
The paper? Miss Marple produced the damp scrap from her reticule. Rosamond, she said, you carried lilies too.
Your cuff told me so. He closed his eyes briefly, a shutter against a flash. Not mine, he murmured.
Left at the church.
For the vicar. Rosamond, he stopped, breath snagging. Tell her.
The visitor, not you. His fingers fluttered toward the door as if to push away a confusion only he could see. Who is she? Miss Marple asked gently. Rosamond? But Nurse Fellows intervened with the righteous authority of the pulse. Enough. He'll have your answers when he has his mind back. Miss Marple stepped into the hallway. The parish clock hummed. Through the haze of people and bunting, she could see the green, where the children were arranging their display, handmade posters, songs pinned to string with wooden pegs. A gust fretted the line. One paper flapped free, skittered along the ground like a living thing, and came to rest against her shoe. She bent, gathered it, and saw the words scrawled quick. When the visitor comes to the green at dusk. Someone practiced in secrecy, had added beneath it, in smaller script, he will kneel in a churchyard, in lilies. By midday the fête reached the plateau of excitement peculiar to events that do not intend to change the world, and often do. Miss Marple moved among stalls, listening the way one drinks tea, small sips, mindful of what the cup hides. She heard Mr. Allerton quarrelling with Mrs. Waycross behind the jam tent, a sound like cutlery arguing with glass. "You'll not bring up those years," Mrs. Waycross hissed. "We did what we did because there was a war and mouths to feed." "And because a child went missing," Mr. Allerton retorted. "And because a ledger didn't balance."
"I have a memory like a vault," Miss Marple approached with a cough that was both apology and introduction.
The quarrel fled, one down the path of indignation, one up the lane of alibis. But the air they left behind kept the print of the words. At 2 o'clock the raffle, which had no ledger and thus no lawful spine, began anyway with the kind of optimistic improvisation that had built the empire and mislaid it again. Mrs. Lively produced a replacement book. Names were taken, numbers invented. We must be flexible, she trilled, a harpsichord of civic virtue. The Lord loves a cheerful giver. The Lord, Mrs. Pritchard muttered to Miss Marple, would love to know where the takings go when cheerful givers stop counting. A murmur passed through the crowd. Heads turned as the journalist from London appeared, tall, thin coat, hat brim sharpened by the journey. He carried a small notebook and an expression like a lit match. Peter Hobday, he announced to no one in particular, which meant everyone, doing a piece on rural moral economies.
I wonder, Miss Marple.
He had the sort of city confidence that taught names to come to heel. Miss Marple smiled the smile she kept for door-to-door evangelists and catalogue salesmen. Mr. Hobday, you will find our morals as carefully priced as our sponge cakes. Splendid, he said, already looking past her. I'm told there was a collapse in the churchyard.
Man with a message?
And there's talk of a letter, black wax, melodrama.
Marvellous copy. Copy, Miss Marple repeated.
An unkind word for a true thing. He laughed, but it missed its own cleverness.
Tell me about Rosamond, he said, voice lowered at the edges.
Name rings a bell. Wartime, yes?
Orphanage?
I found a note in the vestry. Someone's been leaving lilies. Miss Marple glanced at his hands. Ink on the forefinger, no ring. The tobacco she had smelled last night hovered about him like a city ghost. You have a nose for lilies, she said. Do journalists bring flowers as well as notebooks? Sometimes we bring weather, he said, and his eyes slid toward the church as if consulting an accomplice. At 3, the children performed their rhyme. They sang with dreadful prettiness, a little chorus of knives wrapped in lace. Miss Marple, at the edge of the crowd, watched faces instead of mouths, Mrs. Waycross looking rigid, Mr. Allerton amused into malice, Mr. Hobday scribbling, the vicar blinking as if he had mislaid a prayer. When the line came, when the visitor comes to the green at dusk, she saw Mrs. Lively's hand flutter automatically to her throat as if to fasten a necklace that wasn't there. And then, as the rhyme died, the church bell struck a single, solemn note, far too early for evensong. The crowd, eager for direction, turned as one. On the path from the churchyard, the man from the parish room lurched into view, white-faced, coat flapping like a moth's broken wing. Nurse fellows sprinted after him, tradition hopping to keep pace with necessity. He reached the edge of the green, looked about him with the anguished confusion of someone dropped into the wrong century, and his gaze snagged on Miss Marple as if she were the only fixed point in a turning world. He went to his knees, the gesture rippled through the spectators like a draught in a shut room. Kneeling, the word from the child's paper, the line beneath the rhyme. He touched his forehead as if to a memory he could not steady, and tried to speak.
Not you, he whispered. Rosamond, tell... His mouth worked around a shape. Tell her the name she uses is wrong. Nurse fellows reached him, furious with the practical fury of those who keep people living. Mr. Hobday elbowed closer, notebook bright.
The vicar pressed forward with a sanctified confusion. Mrs. Lively's chrysanthemums quivered at their stems. Miss Marple stayed where she was. She watched the man's left sleeve as Nurse Fellows bundled him upright. The cuff was smeared with fresher yellow, the same stubborn pollen. On his trouser hem, a faint streak of white, icing sugar, as if he'd brushed, in passing, the sabotaged cake. But it was the inside of his right wrist that altered the light for her, a scar half-mooned there, old and silvery, the sort of mark left by a childhood burn, or by an evacuation tag's abrasive twine, worn too tight for too long.
Take him in, Nurse Fellows barked. Curiosity is not a disinfectant. The crowd exhaled collectively. Someone laughed for relief and called it manners. The man was borne back to the parish room. The fete resumed with a guilty gusto.
Miss Marple slipped from the press and ducked into the cake tent's stray shadow. She found the leaning plum cake and, with a small knife gloriously unsuited to anything violent, prized up the sugared edge where the oval symbol had been inscribed. There, beneath the icing, someone had pushed a narrow slip of paper into the cooled sponge. She coaxed it free. Miss Marple, it read, the letters fine and certain, before evensong, the vestry, come alone. She looked up and saw, through the tent's open flap, the journalist Peter Hobday watching her with the stillness of a cat before a gap in a fence. His expression was one part triumph, one part curiosity, and something else that did not yet have a name. Behind him, at the far end of the green, a child began the rhyme again, this time softer, slower, as if the song had remembered itself. The wind lifted, bunting twitched, the church bell, uncooperative, held its tongue. Miss Marple folded the note into her glove and stepped out into the light. And there, brushing past her with the practiced clumsiness of deliberate contact, someone slipped something into the pocket of her coat, a small, cold object whose edges told her, with shocking intimacy, that it was a key. Chapter 3. Rooms at the Blue Boar. The Blue Boar Inn was never quite as blue as its name promised. Its sign, paint, faded to the colour of an old bruise, swayed gently in the afternoon wind, and the windows wore lace curtains that trembled as though listening for gossip. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, ale, and old secrets comfortably at home. Miss Marple stepped in quietly, her shoes whispering across the uneven floorboards. The crowd from the fête had begun to spill in, a happy chaos of laughter and cider, but the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Pritchard, noticed her at once. "Back so soon, Miss Marple?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "You'll be looking for tea, I expect, or trouble?" "Both often arrive in the same cup," Miss Marple said gently. "Is our London visitor still in residence?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes darted toward the stairwell. "Upstairs in room 3, said he needed quiet to write his article. But I heard the floorboards going well past midnight. Writers never rest until they've disturbed the innocent, I say." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "May I settle in the parlour a moment? I think better among teapots." A nod, a teacup, and 5 minutes later, Miss Marple sat near the small fire that looked perpetually on the brink of apology. She took out the key slipped into her pocket earlier that day and examined it in the firelight. It was brass, dull with age, with a faint engraving, R.H., the letters barely visible. A hotel key, perhaps, or a drawer. Or, if one were poetic, a memory. The parlour door creaked and Peter Hobday appeared, looking less like a journalist and more like someone rehearsing for the role. His hat was gone, revealing hair that could not decide whether to behave. "Miss Marple," he said, smiling the way men do when they wish to appear disarming. "May I?" "I've never refused good company," she replied. He sat across from her, pulling out a cigarette. "I've been warned you dislike smoke." "I dislike lies," Miss Marple said, her eyes fixed on his match. "Smoke only follows fire." He laughed, but his eyes flickered. "You're sharper than your reputation suggests. I expected a cosy spinster, not an inquisitor." "You'll find the two overlap more than is comfortable," she said. "Now tell me, Mr. Hobday, why did you come to St. Mary Mead? Truly." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the journalist mask slipping. "Because of her," he said. "Rosamond Havers. You remember her?" The name landed between them like a thrown stone. Miss Marple felt the faintest tremor of memory. Wartime, the sound of trains, a pale child in a borrowed coat. "She was an evacuee," Miss Marple said slowly. Sent from London, stayed at the vicarage for a while. Hobday nodded. And then vanished. No trace, no file, nothing. I've been following her for years. She would be 50, if alive. She would not be 50, Miss Marple corrected gently. She would be 51. Of course, he said, half smiling. And you think she's dead? I think death is a habit some people never quite acquire, she said. He took out his notebook. You've received a threat, signed the visitor. I believe it's connected to Rosamond. Do you indeed? Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. She left behind an unfinished letter, Hobday continued. I found it in the National Archive, misfiled under missing evacuees. It ended with your name. My name? Yes. Miss Marple knows the truth. Tell her the fire wasn't an accident. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face remained serene. There was a fire, yes, in the orphanage outside Market Basing.
A dreadful thing, 3 children lost. Hobday nodded. Rosamond survived, or so I thought, until this week when I got a message, unsigned, postmarked, from St. Mary Mead. It said, "The girl with the scar will visit again." Miss Marple set her teacup down very carefully.
The man who collapsed yesterday, he had a scar on his wrist. Yes, Hobday said, which means he knew her, or was looking for her. Before she could answer, the door swung open. Mrs. Pritchard stood there, cheeks flushed with the satisfaction of news. Inspector Cray's here from Market Basing, she announced. Says he needs to speak with you, Miss Marple. Something about the fête grounds. Of course, said Miss Marple. She rose, the key hidden in her gloved hand. As she reached the door, Hobday's voice followed softly. Careful, Miss Marple. Secrets here don't stay buried, they bloom. Outside the rain had begun again, soft and persistent as memory. Inspector Cray was waiting beneath the inn's awning, a man built like a question mark, all angles and suspicion. Miss Marple, he said briskly, apologies for disturbing your tea. The man who collapsed yesterday, he's gone. Gone? Vanished. Nurse Fellows swears she left him asleep, but when she returned, bed empty, window open, mud on the sill, no footprints. No footprints? Miss Marple echoed. Then he left before the rain. Exactly, she thought for a moment. He would have gone where he thought he'd find her. Rosamond. Cray frowned. You think she's alive? I think, said Miss Marple, that some ghosts prefer daylight. The inspector sighed. We found something else behind the church vestry door, an envelope addressed to you. He handed it over. The envelope was damp, the ink blurred, but the handwriting precise. Inside was a single phrase. The key opens what you buried. The truth sleeps beneath the lilies. Miss Marple read it twice, then looked up toward the churchyard, where the lilies grew. The storm clouds were thickening again, swallowing the late sun. She turned back to Cray. Inspector, I shall visit the church before dusk. He frowned. Alone? Alone, she said softly. The dead are better company when they have something to tell. As she walked away, the key pressed cold against her palm. Behind her, the inn door creaked open again, and she caught, just before it closed, a faint echo of a child's voice, high and lilting, from somewhere upstairs, singing under the breath. Rose in the rain, rose in the dark. Miss Marple stopped. The sound was unmistakable, but there were no children staying at the Blue Boar. Chapter 4. Thunder over the Downs. The storm began as a whisper, like someone rehearsing a confession, and by evening it had swollen into a sermon. The skies above St. Mary Mead bruised darkly, rolling with thunder that made even the sturdiest hedges flinch. Lamps flickered alive one by one, little halos of rebellion against the gathering dark. Miss Marple, shawl drawn close, moved steadily up the lane toward St. Mary's Church. In her pocket, the brass key pressed like a heartbeat. "The truth sleeps beneath the lilies," the letter had said. The lilies had been left at the vestry door. It was the kind of riddle she understood too well, because in St. Mary Mead, beauty always grew from something buried. Inside the church, the air was cold and sweet with candle smoke. The stone walls listened. Rain pattered against stained glass saints, blurring their colours into sorrowful streaks. Miss Marple's footsteps echoed as she moved past the pews. The vestry door stood ajar, as if expecting her. She pushed it open gently. The room beyond was narrow, lined with vestments and hymnals. On the wooden table sat a vase of lilies, their scent thick and almost accusatory. She bent closer. Several stems had been roughly cut, as though someone had stolen half the bouquet in haste. There, on the tablecloth beneath them, was a smear of mud in the shape of a handprint. Miss Marple straightened, the storm grumbling above her like an impatient god. She examined the latch of the window, forced open from the outside. The edges of the frame were splintered, and there on the sill lay a single burnt matchstick. Her pulse slowed.
Her mind did not. "A match," she murmured, remembering the half-burnt one found on her mantle.
A pattern, not a coincidence. She turned and stopped. Someone stood in the doorway. "Mr. Hobday," she said softly. The journalist stepped forward.
Hat dripping, eyes shining in the candlelight. "You shouldn't be here alone, Miss Marple." "I rarely am," she replied.
"There's usually a question or two for company." He smiled faintly. "The inspector's looking for you."
"There's been another disappearance." She tilted her head. "Who? Mrs. Waycross?" he said.
"Vanished an hour ago."
Her shop door wide open, light still burning. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed.
"And what brings you to the vestry at this hour, Mr. Hobday?" He hesitated.
"Curiosity. I saw your shadow cross the green." "Curiosity," she said, "is the polite name for motive." He opened his mouth to answer, but a crack of thunder silenced him.
The light sputtered and died. The church plunged into a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. Miss Marple did not scream. She never did. Instead, she reached into her pocket for the small torch she carried for stubborn keyholes and smaller truths. Its beam flicked across the room and caught the glint of something metallic near the lilies. A photograph, half burnt. She lifted it carefully, holding it beneath the trembling torchlight. The edges were scorched, but the image remained. 3 figures standing before the old orphanage gates. One was unmistakably Rosamond, her hair pale as corn. The second, a matron with a fixed smile. The third, blurred by time, was a girl in uniform, no older than 15, her face shadowed but familiar. Miss Marple's breath hitched.
"Oh my," she whispered. "So that's how it is. Who is it?"
Hobday asked. "Someone who's spent her life pretending to be someone else?" Lightning slashed across the stained glass, illuminating the nave for an instant, and in that moment, Miss Marple saw movement behind the altar. "Stay here," she said firmly, already knowing he wouldn't. She moved forward, her shoes soundless on the stone. The thunder rolled again. When she reached the altar, she saw the trap-door half lifted, a passage leading down into the crypt below. A faint draught rose from it, carrying the cold, damp breath of long-kept secrets. "Good heavens," Hobday murmured. "What's down there?" "Confessions," Miss Marple said. "The sort people prefer unspoken." She took a candle from the stand, struck a match, and began her descent. The crypt smelled of old hymns and forgotten rain.
Rows of stone niches lined the walls, each labelled with names worn away by time.
At the far end, beneath the carved angel with a broken wing, something gleamed, metallic, rectangular. A box, small, rusted, locked. Miss Marple knelt before it. The key in her pocket slid perfectly into the lock. The lid creaked open. Inside lay a child's evacuation tag, still threaded with a loop of rough twine. The name on it was blurred but legible, Rosamond Havers. Beneath it, folded and yellowed, was a page torn from a wartime ledger. It listed evacuees assigned to St. Mary Mead, and then, in a different ink, a correction. Rosamond Havers, transferred to Market Basing Orphanage, 1941. But next to it, someone had written, "No record received, a missing child on paper and in life." Miss Marple's heart thudded. "So she never left," she murmured. "She was here all along." Suddenly the candle flickered violently. She turned and froze. Hobday was gone. The stairs above were empty, the hatch still open, but swinging slightly. Then, faintly, from somewhere in the nave above, she heard the unmistakable sound of movement, swift, deliberate, and then a door slamming shut. She hurried up the steps, candle trembling in her grip. The church was darker now, filled only with the faint blue shimmer of stormlight through glass. She crossed the aisle quickly, passing the lilies again, and stopped short. Every flower had been cut down, its stems arranged neatly in a circle upon the floor. In their centre lay Mrs. Waycross's brooch, a small silver cross she never removed. A message.
A warning.
Or both. Footsteps echoed behind her. She spun, candle raised, but it was only Inspector Cray, drenched and impatient.
"Miss Marple," he barked. "You're not supposed to be here."
"Nor is anyone else," she replied calmly. "And yet they are." He stared at the lilies.
"What in God's name? Not God's work, Inspector. Someone else's devotion entirely." The thunder crashed above them like a verdict. At that moment,
the church bell began to ring, not the calm chime of Sunday service, but a wild, erratic tolling. Miss Marple looked up sharply.
"The belfry," she whispered.
"Someone's up there." Before Cray could stop her, she was already climbing the narrow stairs, her candle guttering with every step. The wind screamed through the bell tower, driving rain in sideways. When she reached the top, she saw the rope swinging violently and the open hatch beyond, leading to the roof. A figure was there, hooded, soaked, back turned. "Stop!" she called. The figure froze, then turned slowly. Lightning flared, and for a heartbeat she saw the face beneath the hood, pale, hollow-cheeked, with eyes like wet glass. The man from the churchyard. He looked at her, lips moving soundlessly, and raised one shaking hand toward her, then over her shoulder. She turned, just as a flash split the sky. The bell rope snapped, whipping through the air like a serpent. It struck the beam above her with a thunderous crack, showering splinters. When the light faded, the man was gone. Only the bell swayed above.
Moaning as though mourning its own crime, Miss Marple,
trembling but unbroken, steadied herself against the wall. The candle had died. The darkness around her was alive with echoes, and on the floor of the belfry, half trodden into the wet dust, she saw a fresh print of a woman's shoe. Small.
"Narrow and heeled, Rosamond," she whispered.
Or the one who wears her name. Chapter 5. The girl in the photograph. By morning, the storm had washed the village clean, or at least that was the lie the sunlight told. The puddles mirrored a sky too blue to trust, and the thatched roofs glistened like penitent saints. St. Mary Mead woke with the shy, embarrassed air of a place that had misbehaved under cover of night. Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat through the hours between thunder and dawn, mending a small tear in her glove and thinking about the lilies.
About the man in the belfry, about the woman who wore another's name.
The half-burnt photograph lay on her table, its edges crisped, its meaning half-formed. Rosamond Havers, the lost evacuee, stared out from the past, pale, solemn, her eyes uncertain of kindness. Beside her, the matron's smile was as stiff as her collar. But the third figure, the girl in uniform, was what snagged at Miss Marple's mind. That face, faintly shadowed and yet familiar, seemed to haunt the air of the cottage itself. The vicarage clock struck 7. Miss Marple rose, wrapped her shawl, and stepped into the damp hush of the morning.
A visit to the vicarage, Reverend Lively, opened the door with the expression of a man who expected repentance but would settle for company. His wife was already fussing over a breakfast tray, and the scent of burnt toast sanctified the air.
"Miss Marple," Mrs. Lively exclaimed, "you look positively spectral. Do say you've come to supervise the fête clean-up. Poor Mrs. Waycross has vanished, and her jam jars are still uncollected." "Jam can wait," Miss Marple said gently.
"I'd like a word with the vicar about the vestry lilies." "The lilies?" Mrs. Lively paled. "Horrid things. I told him they'd bring funerals instead of blessings." "Possibly both," Miss Marple said. Reverend Lively frowned.
"My dear lady, if this is about the burglary, Inspector Cray assured me, I'm afraid it's about something older," she interrupted softly. "The orphanage fire of 1941, you knew about it?" His gaze faltered. "I was a boy then. My father had this parish. It was wartime, chaos, refugees, records misplaced." "Children misplaced," Miss Marple corrected. He hesitated. "Yes. One of them was sent here. Rosamond, I believe." "Sweet child. Quiet. She used to sit in the pew by the south window. Then, one day, gone." "Gone," Miss Marple repeated. "And yet she may never have left." He looked bewildered. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple reached into her bag and placed the photograph on the table between them. "Do you recognize anyone here?" The vicar bent closer. His breath caught. "Good heavens! The matron! Yes, that's Mrs. Selby, and that's Rosamond. But the third, why, that looks like—" Mrs. Lively leaned over his shoulder and gasped. "That looks like me!" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It does, doesn't it?" Mrs. Lively's hand trembled as she picked up the photograph. "But I wasn't there. I grew up in Dorset. My mother was—" She stopped, confusion fluttering across her features. "Wasn't she?" Reverend Lively placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Darling, perhaps you're mistaken." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "someone else was mistaken for you." 2. The confession by midday, the vicarage felt colder than the church. Mrs. Lively sat very still by the hearth, staring into a cup of untouched tea. "It's absurd," she said faintly. "I remember a house, a white one, by the sea. I remember being told I was adopted after the war. I never asked from where. My mother said it didn't matter." Miss Marple nodded. "And your maiden name was Rosamond."
"Rosamond Hale." The vicar inhaled sharply. Miss Marple leaned forward. "You took your husband's name, but before that you were Rosamond, and you were sent here as an evacuee under the name Havers. The orphanage burned before any official record could contradict it."
"You grew up believing you were someone else's charity case, when in truth you were the missing girl." Mrs. Lively's eyes filled slowly, like a glass under a trembling hand. "But then, who was the other one? The one in the photograph?" "The matron's niece," Miss Marple said softly. "She must have taken your identity to claim your small inheritance. The Hale Trust, wasn't it? enough to buy her way to comfort after the war. And you, my dear, became her ghost. Reverend Lively sat down heavily. My God. Not yet, Miss Marple murmured. I'm afraid someone else has used that confusion very cleverly indeed. The letters, the lilies, they're meant to frighten you, to make you believe the past has come for you. But it's not the past that knocks, it's guilt. Lively shuddered. Then who sent the letter to you? Why involve you? Because they needed me to see the pattern, Miss Marple said, rising. And because someone thought you might confess before they finished what they started. 3. The stranger returns. By late afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived with grim news. Mrs. Waycross has been found, he announced, standing in Miss Marple's sitting room. In the river, drowned, Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Poor woman, and yet too neat, too early. Cray frowned. Early? She knew something, Miss Marple said. And someone wanted her silence before evensong. She mentioned those years at the fête, likely referring to the evacuation. Cray scratched his chin. You think it's connected? Everything is, Inspector. Murder is only housekeeping delayed. A knock interrupted them. Mrs. Pritchard stood at the door, shawl clutched against the wind. There's a gentleman to see you, Miss Marple, she said, breathless. The thin one from London, Mr. Hobday. He's back, and he's brought a bag. A bag? Yes. Says it belonged to Mrs. Waycross. 4. The bag Mr. Hobday stood by the fire when Miss Marple entered, the canvas bag at his feet. His coat was damp again, but his eyes were bright with purpose. Inspector, he greeted. I found this by the mill stream. Thought you'd like a look. Cray crouched, unfastened the clasp, and drew out its contents. A woman's purse, a handkerchief embroidered with WW, a small bottle of perfume, and a photograph identical to the one on Miss Marple's table, except this one wasn't burnt. 3 figures again, but clearer now, Rosamond Havers, the matron, and the 3rd figure, no longer shadowed. A girl in uniform, dark-haired, watchful, Mrs. Waycross. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. So she was there too. Hobday looked at her sharply. Meaning? She was the matron's niece, the one who stole Rosamond's name, the one who made a life out of a lie. Cray blinked. Then what was Mrs. Lively? The original Rosamond, Miss Marple said. But she didn't know. Not until now. She picked up the photograph again, studying it. And whoever killed Mrs. Waycross knew both truths and feared one more coming out. Hobday exhaled. Then the visitor isn't coming, Miss Marple said softly. He's already here. V. The shadow at the door, the clock struck 6. Outside the rain had begun again, softer this time, a lullaby for secrets. Inspector Cray gathered his notes. We'll have to bring Mrs. Lively in for questioning. For her own safety, of course. Do, Miss Marple said absently. Her gaze had drifted to the window where the lamplight caught a reflection in the glass. A shadow moving past the gate, tall, deliberate. When she turned, it was gone. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe you'll find your killer before the next bell tolls. He looked doubtful. And how's that? Because they've just walked past my garden wall, she said, rising. And they're not alone. Cray snatched his hat. Hobday followed, pulling his notebook from his pocket. But Miss Marple remained where she was, looking down at the brass key gleaming faintly on the table. The truth sleeps beneath the lilies, she murmured. And now someone means to wake it. A knock rattled the door. Once. Twice. Then silence. Miss Marple reached for the handle, and from the other side came a voice, soft, female, trembling with something halfway between guilt and grief. Please, Miss Marple, it whispered, don't let him find me. Chapter 6. Tea Leaves and Telltales. The voice outside Miss Marple's door trembled like porcelain under pressure. Rain hissed along the window panes, and the village beyond seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple, calm as a clock, opened the door. Mrs. Lively stood there, bareheaded, drenched to the bone, her shawl clinging like seaweed. Her eyes were wild with that particular kind of fear that comes not from danger itself, but from recognition. "Come in, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "before the neighbours see reason to embroider this moment." Mrs. Lively stumbled inside.
"He knows," she gasped.
"The visitor?"
"He's here. He followed me from the church." "The church?"
"Yes, I went to pray, but someone had left something there, a cup of tea on the altar, still warm."
"As if," her voice faltered.
"As if they'd been waiting for me." Miss Marple guided her toward the hearth. "A cup of tea is seldom innocent," she murmured, "especially when it's left for one person only. I the cup and the key, Mrs." Lively clutched her soaked sleeves.
"He said my name," she whispered.
"Not my married name. The old one. Rosamond. He said it in the dark." Miss Marple stirred the fire gently. Sparks leapt up like startled thoughts.
"And yet you came here, not to the vicarage."
"'Cause you know the threat isn't from a stranger, don't you?" Mrs. Lively stared into the flames. "You think I'm mad?" "I think you're remembering." The woman's shoulders shook. "There was another girl in the orphanage, older. She said she'd protect me, but she lied. She made me switch the name tag so she could leave."
"I never saw her again until she became Mrs. Waycross," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Lively looked up sharply.
"Then the man, the one who fell in the churchyard, he must have known. He said something about the visitor not being me."
"That must mean that there's someone else still alive who remembers what really happened," Miss Marple finished.
"And that person is using you as bait." At that moment the kettle began to whistle. Miss Marple crossed the room with practised ease, poured 2 cups and set one before her guest. Mrs. Lively hesitated. "You still have the habit," she murmured. "I find boiling water reveals more truth than most people," Miss Marple said. "Sugar?" The woman nodded faintly. Miss Marple added a spoonful, stirred, and passed the cup over. Her eyes, kind and sharp in equal measure, watched as Mrs. Lively took the first sip. "Bitter," Mrs. Lively said softly. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "That's not from the tea." 2. Inspector Cray's return. The door banged open without warning. Inspector Cray strode in, shaking the rain from his coat. "Forgive me, Miss Marple."
"Urgent news."
They found the London man's luggage at the inn, his press badge, his notes, everything. But not him. Mr. Hobday's disappeared. "Disappeared?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "He's developing quite a talent for that," Cray frowned.
"You knew?"
"I suspected," she said. "His stories had too much ink and too few truths. He was no journalist. And who was he?" "A man with a past to rewrite," Miss Marple replied.
"And a name to bury," Cray blinked.
"Meaning?" "Meaning," she said softly, "that Peter Hobday never existed before last year. The man staying at the Blue Boar, he's the boy who survived the orphanage fire. The boy who watched Rosamond and the matron's niece change their name tags. The boy who carried the wrong guilt all his life," Cray swore under his breath. "Then he's the visitor." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, the visitor has more patience than grief." As if summoned by her words, a soft clink broke the silence, the sound of porcelain against wood. They turned. Mrs. Lively's teacup trembled in her hand, her complexion grey. "Poison," Miss Marple said, calm but quick. She darted forward, knocking the cup aside before the last drop touched the woman's lips. Cray caught her as she slumped sideways.
"Good God, how—" Miss Marple bent to sniff the tea.
"Bitter almonds," she murmured.
"Cyanide."
"Classic, if a touch theatrical. But the kettle, I filled it myself," Miss Marple said. "Which means the poison wasn't in the water, it was in the cup." Her gaze lifted to the shelf where her teacups sat in a tidy row. One at the end had a faint smear of something shiny near the rim. Clear, oily, deliberate. "Someone prepared it before we came in," she said. "Which means they've been in this room since before dusk." Cray stiffened. "You mean they're still here?" Miss Marple nodded. "Perhaps listening even now." 3. The trap 10 minutes later, Mrs. Lively, alive though dazed, rested in the vicarage under nurse's care. Inspector Cray posted 2 constables by her door. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned to her cottage with a plan as quiet as it was dangerous. The poisoner, she reasoned, had acted in haste. The tea had been meant for her, not for Rosamond. The letter had been clear enough. "I have come to kill you." Someone had changed the target. At 9 o'clock, she brewed another pot of tea, this time deliberately perfumed with lavender. She poured it into 2 cups, one of which she placed on the table near the window, in plain sight. The other she left by the fire untouched. Then she waited. The night pressed close around the cottage, velvet and heavy. Wind rattled the eaves like old bones. At 9:10, the floorboard near the back room creaked. Once, twice. "Good evening, Mr. Hobday," she said, into the dark. He froze in the doorway, dripping rain, his face drawn and hollow. "You knew I'd come?" "Of course. You left your story half finished." He took a step forward.
You think I wanted this? I didn't. I came to warn you. She killed Mrs. Waycross. She? Yes, Rosamond, the vicar's wife.
She found out the truth and snapped, said the past had to be cleaned. "I followed her to the river, but she was already gone." Miss Marple studied him. "And yet it wasn't her who poisoned the tea."
She was here, terrified.
"You, however, knew which cup I'd use." He swallowed.
No, I swear. You used that same poison in your childhood, she said, voice soft but merciless.
"In the orphanage kitchen. The matron's tea, wasn't it? The night before the fire." Hobday flinched.
She was cruel. She would have exposed you.
Miss Marple finished. "Because you weren't a boy at all." The silence snapped like the storm outside. His face paled. "I saw your photograph, Mr. Hobday," Miss Marple continued. "Or should I say Miss Hobday? The other evacuee. The matron's second ward. A girl dressed as a boy to escape the requisition trains."
You've kept that disguise all your life. I did what I had to, she hissed. I imagine you did, Miss Marple said.
"But now you've mistaken justice for revenge. You've tried to kill Rosamond for a crime she never committed. She stole my name." "No," Miss Marple said. "She survived what you did." Hobday's hand trembled toward her coat pocket. Something metal flashed, the glint of a small pistol, clumsy in her grasp. Miss Marple didn't move. "You've already poisoned the past, my dear. Don't stain the present, too." A moment stretched long enough to hold a lifetime. Then the door burst open. Inspector Cray's voice cracked through the air.
"Drop it!"
The gun clattered to the floor. Hobday staggered, the fight leaking out of her. "She burned everything," she sobbed. "The records, the names. She said we were ghosts now." Miss Marple stepped forward gently, taking her by the arm. "Then let the living finish the story." Foul! The thread tightens hours later. The cottage was quiet again. Hobday sat in custody, the pistols sealed in evidence. Mrs. Lively slept under watch. Inspector Cray poured himself a whisky he didn't enjoy, and Miss Marple, alone once more, stared at the brass key on her mantel. It still gleamed faintly in the firelight, engraved R.H. Rosamond Hale. Not Hobday.
Not Waycross, the real Rosamond's key. She turned it over in her palm, frowning.
It was too deliberate, too planted. And then she saw it, tiny flecks of white under the grooves.
Not dust, not wax. Icing sugar, the same sugar from the sabotaged cake.
The one marked with the oval and flame. Miss Marple's pulse quickened.
"Oh," she whispered.
"So the poison wasn't meant for me after all. It was meant for him." The clock struck midnight, the note sharp as truth. Outside, the church bell answered once, deep, mournful, and wrong. Someone was tolling it. Someone who should have been in custody. Chapter 7. The Knitted Noose. The bell tolled again, slow, deliberate, echoing across the sleeping roofs of St. Mary Mead. Each strike rolled through the air like a verdict. Miss Marple set her teacup down, reached for her shawl, and rose with the quiet certainty of a woman who had already guessed the shape of the ending. Outside, the night was cold enough to sharpen thought. The church loomed ahead, pale and spectral against the bruised sky. Somewhere above, a lantern swayed in the belfry, throwing a fractured light across the rain-wet stones. Inspector Cray's constables had vanished from their posts or fled, no matter which. In Miss Marple's experience, terror was often punctual. She crossed the churchyard slowly, her shoes whispering against gravel. The lilies, those cursed, lovely lilies, had been cut down once more. Only their stems remained, like green fingers pointing toward the vestry door. It stood open. The rope and the ring inside candlelight guttered weakly. The smell of smoke and damp wool hung heavy, and there, at the altar rail, something moved, a shape hunched low, muttering to itself. "Mrs. Lively," Miss Marple said softly. The vicar's wife turned, her face pale as milk. She held a rosary in one hand and a length of thick knitted rope in the other. "It's over," Miss Marple said.
"He's gone."
"You needn't run any more." Mrs. Lively's laugh was soft, strange.
"Gone? Oh no, Miss Marple."
"Gone is never gone. They all come back." The matron, Mrs. Waycross, the man who called himself Hobday, every one of them. "Rosamond, my name," she whispered, trembling. "You know what it means?"
"Rose of the world." She used to call me that, the matron. Then she'd lock me in the pantry for stealing jam. Her hand clenched the rope tighter.
"I didn't mean to hurt anyone."
"Not then, not now."
But she wouldn't stop lying.
"Even in death." "The poison," Miss Marple said quietly.
"You used it, didn't you?" "Not Hobday," Mrs. Lively nodded once. She was going to tell. "She said I'd never been Rosamond at all, that I was just a foundling from London, and the real girl died in the fire. She said she'd tell the vicar. Ruin me!" Miss Marple took a careful step forward. "So you made certain she couldn't?" "I only meant her to sleep," she cried. "Just sleep. But then the river took her. The river takes everything. And now?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Now it's my turn to give something back." Miss Marple's gaze fell to the knitted rope. Not a random thing. It was a church bell rope, cut and rewoven with precision. "A noose, Rosamond," she said gently. "What do you think confession means?" Mrs. Lively looked up, her eyes bright and fevered. "It means you stop pretending, too." The visitor revealed a gust of wind slammed through the door. The candles sputtered, the church shuddered. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the nave. Inspector Cray appeared, pistol drawn, his face hard with disbelief.
"What in God's name?" Mrs. Lively whirled toward him, the rope raised like a relic. "Stay back!"
"Rosamond," Miss Marple said sharply. "Don't." But the vicar's wife had already turned toward the altar. She climbed the steps slowly as though ascending to judgment itself. "I saw him," she said. "The one you called Hobday. He came back to the church last night."
"He said I had stolen her life."
"He said he'd make me pay." Miss Marple's heart quickened.
"You saw him alive?" "Yes," she breathed.
"He was in the belfry. He told me to kneel." The rhyme echoed in Miss Marple's mind. "When the visitor comes to the green at dusk, he will kneel." But this time the visitor had come to the church.
Not the green, the lilies, the letters.
The child's song, all had pointed here. Miss Marple's eyes went wide.
"Oh, heavens," she whispered.
"The visitor wasn't Hobday," Cray frowned.
"Then who?" "The vicar," Miss Marple said. Mrs. Lively froze. Reverend Lively stepped from the shadows behind the pulpit, face calm, eyes unreadable.
"You've always been too perceptive, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "But late, this time." He moved closer, the light catching on the ring at his finger, an oval seal carved with a flicker inside, the same symbol as the black wax, Reverend, Miss Marple said softly. You sent the letters. Yes. I wrote to her, my wife, as the visitor.
I wanted her to remember who she was. You wanted her to break, Miss Marple said. He smiled faintly.
You see, I knew the truth long before she did. I found the orphanage records when we married. I knew she wasn't Rosamond Hale, merely a frightened imposter. But she was beautiful, gentle, useful.
Until Mrs. Waycross began whispering. So you silenced them both. I did what any man of God might, he said.
Protected my household. Mrs. Lively stared at him, horror and clarity mingling like oil in water.
You poisoned her tea, she whispered. Not me. I slipped it into the cup you poured, he said.
So simple. The law would blame you, the mad wife with a past. Cray raised his pistol. Enough talk, the vicar only smiled.
Put that away, Inspector.
This is holy ground. And then he moved faster than any of them.
Expected, snatching the noose from his wife's
hands and looping it over the iron hook that once held the bell rope. Miss Marple's cry was sharp as the crack of thunder. Don't be a coward now, Reverend. But he was already climbing the altar rail, the rope in his hands, the smile gone. God forgives, he murmured. But people don't. The rope tightened. Cray lunged forward. Too late. The beam groaned, the candlelight flickered, and the vicar swung gently, his shadow turning on the wall like a slow pendulum. The evidence in the ashes, it was dawn before they cut him down. Rain fell steadily through the broken roof tiles, dripping onto stone and silence alike. Inspector Cray sat on a pew, rubbing his eyes. He was the visitor. The ring, the letters, all his doing. But why you, Miss Marple? She looked tired but unshaken. He wanted an audience.
All villains do.
He knew I'd see what others ignored, Cray sighed. You've seen too much death for one village? She smiled faintly. Villages breed death, Inspector.
Everyone knows everyone's sins. They simply wait for the proper weather. From the altar, a constable approached, holding out a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth.
Found this under the rail, ma'am? Inside lay a single notebook, the vicar's handwriting neat as prayer. Each page catalogued the events of the past weeks, the letters, the lilies, the threats. At the very end, one final line, Miss Marple will understand. Evil is only ever polite until it's cornered. The quiet. After later that morning, Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting by habit more than thought. The wool wound between her fingers, blue, soft, endless. The storm had passed. The world smelled of clean earth and distant sin. Mrs. Lively was taken to hospital, half conscious, murmuring half-forgotten rhymes. Inspector Cray departed, leaving her with a curt nod of gratitude. Alone again, Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and looked toward the church. The bell was still now, but she could almost hear it, one last echo of warning rolling across the downs. She glanced down at her lap. Somewhere in her quiet labor, she had tied the wool into a perfect loop. A noose, delicate and blue. She smiled faintly.
We all make patterns, she whispered.
Some with yarn, some with lives. And as she reached for her scissors to cut the thread, a gust of wind slipped through the open window, scattering the papers on her table. The half-burnt photograph fluttered to the floor, Rosamond's face staring up once more. Only now, in the light of morning, Miss Marple saw what she hadn't before, the faint shadow of another figure reflected in the glass behind them.
A man. Young. Wearing a clerical collar. The vicar's father. Her smile faded. So that's where the pattern began, she said, softly.
Not with the visitor, but with the inheritance of sin. The kettle began to sing. The village stirred, but the bell, somewhere beyond, gave one last, accidental chime, like laughter that refused to die. Chapter 8. Harvest of Shadows. Morning in St. Mary. Mead dawned bright and unrepentant. The rain had scoured the village to its bones, and now the sunlight fell like judgment across rooftops and cobbles alike. The fête bunting hung limp and colourless, the stalls empty except for a few abandoned paper tickets dissolving into the grass. Miss Marple rose early, brewed her tea, and stood for a long while at the window. The church spire gleamed through the mist, too clean, too tall, as if unaware that its sanctity had been stained by the night's work. The visitor was dead, the village said, but Miss Marple knew better. Evil didn't die, it simply changed its name and waited for another season to bloom. I, a stranger? In morning, Inspector Cray returned just after breakfast, looking thinner and more reluctant than usual. He held his hat like a confession. "They'll close the case today," he said.
Death by suicide, 2 victims, no further suspects.
"A tidy ending for what it's worth." "Tidy endings," Miss Marple said, "exist only in police reports and fairy tales." Cray half smiled. "I suppose you'll tell me there's still a thread dangling." "There always is." She gestured toward the chair opposite. "Tea?" he nodded. "Doctor says Mrs. Lively will recover. She's in Market Basing Infirmary, sedated. Keeps asking for her husband." Miss Marple stirred her tea, her spoon turning slow circles. "And for Rosamond?" He blinked.
"I thought she was Rosamond." Miss Marple looked up.
"That's the trick of lies, Inspector. They breed until you can't tell one from the litter." He frowned.
"You mean—"
"I mean," she said softly, "the woman in the hospital bed is not Rosamond Hale. She never was. 2. The real Rosamond. The revelation came to her at dawn."
As most truths do, quietly, with the certainty of something that had always been there.
The photograph, the child's rhyme, the brass key, each had pointed to the same ghost. "The girl in the photograph," Miss Marple said. "The one we thought was the matron's niece. She was Rosamond Hale. The other, the shy one by the sea, was an imposter from the start." Cray sat forward. "Then who was the imposter?" "Mrs. Waycross," Miss Marple said simply. She switched the tags before the evacuation. The orphanage records were falsified to cover her theft of Rosamond's inheritance. But Rosamond survived the fire, and she came back years later under a new name. Cray frowned. "Hobday?" She nodded. Rosamond Hale became Peter Hobday, the boy survivor. She cut her hair, disguised her voice, and carried the secret all her life. When she learned the vicar's wife had been living under her stolen name, she returned to reclaim her story. Then she was the real visitor. "Yes," Miss Marple said.
"But not the killer."
"The vicar saw her as a threat and used her arrival to mask his own crimes. He poisoned Mrs. Waycross, frightened his wife into confession, and then played martyr when the truth closed in." Cray sat back, exhaling. "So the visitor came not to kill but to confess," Miss Marple smiled faintly, "as visitors so often do." The letter in the lily box. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the church. The constables had gone. The door stood open again, as though pretending nothing had happened. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and lilies, faded, bruised, but still perfumed with their terrible beauty. She crossed to the vestry, where a small wooden box rested beneath the altar. Inside, she found what she had been half expecting, a folded note, its paper damp and soft with age. She opened it carefully. "Miss Marple, you see more than most and kinder than most."
"I did come to kill once."
"But not her, not the woman who wore my name."
"I came to kill what was left of me."
"You've spared me that. When they find this, I'll be gone, back to the place where ghosts belong. Tell her, if she wakes, that I forgive her. Tell her that the lilies were for remembrance, not revenge." R.H. Miss Marple closed the note, pressing it lightly between her fingers. For a long moment she stood very still, listening to the silence. Then she whispered, "And may you rest at last." Rosamond Hale found for the final stitch. That evening, the villagers gathered at the Blue Boar not to celebrate, but because silence was too sharp to bear alone. Rumour and relief mingled with ale. Laughter came like hiccups. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, knitting in the warm light, while conversations ebbed and flowed around her, like polite ghosts. Can you imagine? Mrs. Pritchard whispered.
The vicar and his poor wife, such a sweet woman. Madness, said another.
Pure religious madness, Miss Marple did not correct them. Madness was a convenient coat for evil. It spared people from recognizing its reflection. She tied off her final thread and laid the knitting aside, a simple blue shawl patterned with loops and crosses. The same pattern, she realized, as the rope from the church. A knitted noose, she murmured, and mercy woven into every knot, she smiled to herself. Well, perhaps that's balance. Vi epilogue, the visitor. Who stayed 2 weeks later, the village returned to its routines, harvests, sermons, and gossip about the weather. The fête committee began planning next year's event, with promises of no dramatics this time. One morning, Miss Marple received a small parcel by post.
No return address.
Inside, wrapped in brown paper, was a pressed white lily and a single train ticket from Market Basing to London. 3rd class, never used. On the back of the ticket, someone had written in a neat, unfamiliar hand for the lady who saw the truth. The visitor. Miss Marple smiled, then tucked the ticket into her Bible. Between Psalms and Proverbs, the verses about mercy, not vengeance. Outside, the church bell rang, clear and even now, no longer tolling for the dead. She poured her tea, sat by the window and watched the village move on. Children played where the fête once stood. Mrs. Lively's house was shuttered but quiet. The lilies in her own garden opened toward the sun, innocent and unknowing. Miss Marple lifted her cup.
To visitors, she said softly.
And to the ones who never really leave. The clock struck noon. Somewhere far off, a train whistle echoed through the downs, one last sound of departure, fading slowly into peace. The end,